Hey guys, so we're going to start Chapter 8 today. Chapter 8 is Quadratic Equations and Inequalities. We've done a lot of factoring quadratics. Quadratics meaning that there's a quadratic term, x squared, like right here in number 1. The standard form of a quadratic equation. Please write this down. Remembering the zero product property, we went over a little bit of this already. If you have two things that are multiplied to equal 0, one or the other or both have to be 0. So let's take a minute and look at number 1. We have to remember we always have to have it set equal to 0. So let's move that 15 over. Step 2, factor. Step 3, use the zero product property and set each of your factors equal to 0. Step 4, solve each of those equations. So your answer to number 1 is x equals 5 or x equals negative 3. All right, take a few seconds and try out number 2. Make sure that you move the 3 to the other side. Since x squared has a coefficient other than 1, you have a little bit of work to do. You can decide whether to do guess and check or the method of moving the 4 back to the negative 3, but do not forget that that 4 needs to be in the front. So your two terms need to be able to multiply to get 4x squared. If you need help factoring for number 2, look up here in our little bubble up here. I moved the 4 to multiply to the negative 3 and got negative 12. Two things that multiply get negative 12 and their difference is positive 11, so positive 12, negative 1. Since the 4 is involved, you have to divide both of them by 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3. However, 1/4 can't stay. You have to move the 4 back in the front, so that is where I got these two factors from. Set them equal to 0, and go ahead and solve those two factors out, set equal to 0, and solve each of those equations to find your two values of x. That would be the answers to number 2. So your answers are positive 1/4 and negative 3. All right, now let's try these two examples. Number 3, we have the a involved, so we got to be careful when factoring. So two things that multiply together to get x squared, x and x. Two things that multiply to get a squared, a and a. Notice that when you multiply inner outer, there'd be ax and ax, so that we're good with our variables. So we really just need to focus on two numbers that multiply to get 32 and add to get 12. That would be 8 and 4, so plus 8 plus 4. Setting them equal to 0. X plus 8a equals 0. X equals negative 8a. And for this one, x equals negative 4a. We don't know what a is, but that's okay. We're just solving that equation. Number 4. It looks like we are nice because it has factored on the right-hand side of the equation. However, nothing set equal to 0. So simplify by distributing this x and moving your entire simplified equation to one side to set it equal to 0. So I decided to move this x and the 9 to the right-hand side so that x squared would be positive. So negative 5x minus x, negative 6x. Move the 9 over. This should be a plus. My apologies. All right, factoring this. Two numbers will multiply getting positive 9, and their difference, their sum is negative 6. So x minus 3 and x minus 3, or we can write it as x minus 3 squared. The inverse of something squared is taking the square root. So x minus 3 equals 0. So this one only has one solution, x equals 3. All right, now we are going to write quadratic equations in standard form by given the answers, the solutions. So if you ever wondered how I came up with any questions, and instead of just throwing up random values for a, b, and c, you start what you want the answers to be and go backwards. So let's start with something simple, number 5. If negative 1 is a solution to your quadratic equation, that means one of your things here, x equals negative 1, the factor that would be equal to 0 would have to be x plus 1 equals 0. I moved the 1 to the other side. So this is one of your factors. Likewise, if 5 is a solution, what would your other factor be? Your other factor would be x minus 5. So your quadratic equation in standard form, we have to take these two factors and multiply them together using FOIL to get it to standard form. So x squared, negative 5x, positive 1 would be negative 4x minus 5. So this would be the equation that has negative 1 and 5 as solutions. Number 6, a little bit more challenging because they're fractions. So if you have negative 4/5 or 2/3 as your solutions, the first step you need to do, please make sure you take note of this, the first step you need to do is get rid of the denominator. So multiply both sides by 5 here, so 5x equals negative 4. So your one factor will be 5x plus 4. Take a second and come up with what your other factor would be if x equals 2/3 is your solution. If you said 3x minus 2, you are correct. So go ahead and multiply those two binomials together to come up with your quadratic equation in standard form. If this is what you got for your quadratic, you are correct. This is 2x because it was negative 10x plus 12x. So that is the quadratic equation standard form that would result in these two fractions being the solutions. All right, now we learned about square roots last chapter, so we're going to use them to solve these equations here. So if you only have one term that has a variable and it's squared, isolate that variable and solve by taking the inverse of something squared, which is the square root. So number 1, write this down. Move 25 to the other side, so you have 4x squared equals 25. Get rid of the 4. So you have x squared equals 25/4. The inverse of something squared is taking the square root. So we are going to take the square root of both sides. The biggest difference for taking the square root of an equation is you need to take the positive and the negative versions of that square root. We're not just taking the principal root anymore, because a negative value for x, when you square it, is positive. So x in this case is going to be positive or negative. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 4 is 2. So our two answers, what this means here is x equals 5/2 or x equals negative 5/2. If we plugged in either of these two values in for x, squaring 5/2, you get 5 times 5, 25. 2 times 2 is 4. And the same thing here, negative 5 squared is 25 and 2 squared is 4. So both of those answers work. Number 2, solving for z. Move the 8 to the other side. Before, we say, oh, we can't take square roots of negatives. However, now we just learned about the complex number, so we can solve this equation for z, because now we have a variable that represents the square root of negative 1. So we take the square root. Whenever you take the square root, always have to remember to put a plus or a minus. So I'm going to go back over here and put plus minus. So z equals the positive and negative square root of negative 8. The square root of a negative is I. We're going to take an I out. Square root of 8 is the square root of 2 cubed. So that turns into, my cube's up a little too big there, 2I root 2. And we need plus or minus. So this will be the final answer for z. You can keep that plus and minus together or separate it as 2I root 2 or negative 2I root 2. Number 3. We have a parenthesis here with something squared. The old method would be to FOIL x plus 1 out, move the 9 over, and then try to refactor. But there's no other terms outside of the parentheses that have any variables in it. So you are allowed to isolate your parentheses and take the square root of the entire thing. So take the square root, so x plus 1, because the square root and that square cancel out, and this would become positive or negative 3. That's plus or minus 3. That means positive 3 or negative 3. Instead of trying to subtract 1 and being confused with plus or minus, I'm going to rewrite this as two equations. X plus 1 equals 3, or x plus 1 equals negative 3. Notice that 1 stays positive. Some people change that because they're confused by this plus or minus. This is talking about the 3. So our two possible answers for this are 3 minus 1, which is 2, or negative 3 minus 1, negative 4. All right, last example here. We have to isolate the parentheses here. So step 1 is move that 32 over. Let's use orange, why not? So t minus 1/4 squared equals 32. Now we're going to take the square root of both sides. T minus 1/4, that squared one away, plus or minus 32. That is 16 times 2. The square root of 16 is 4, or that would have been 2 to the 5th, and you could take two groups of 2 out, or you can just say the square root of 16, which is 4, so that is 4 root 2. Our last step, we need to move this 1/4. So we're going to add it to both sides. Getting ready for something that's coming a little bit later in this chapter. That 1/4, I'm going to move to the front here, plus or minus 4 root 2. This is fine. If you were to see a multiple choice test on a standardized test later on, if they break that up into two answers, you would see t equals 1/4 plus 4 root 2, and t equals 1/4 minus 4 root 2. The reasoning behind, I guess these would need to be in the same box, apologies. The reason why you put 1/4 in the front here is so that this plus or minus, you don't get confused that you need to distribute it. This 1/4 is always positive because you moved it from the left to the right and it was negative here, so it's going to be positive. All right, so that is it for solving quadratic equations with factoring, which is review from a previous chapter, and by taking the square roots. So notice this taking the square roots only works when you have your variable inside of a parentheses isolated with something squared, or only one term with a variable that is being squared. Thanks guys, let me know if you have any questions.